In August of 1975, a man sat in a racing car at one of the fastest circuits in the world and prepared for what should have been a routine warm-up session before a Grand Prix. He had already won everything American motorsport could offer. He had driven the most powerful racing car ever built. He had set records that would stand for over a decade. And 3 days after that warm-up session began, he was dead. This is the story of Mark Donohue, the engineer who became a driver, the perfectionist who helped destroy a racing series through sheer dominance, and the pursuit of excellence that ultimately cost him his life. This is Motorsport Heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about the drivers and machines that shaped racing history in ways most people never get to hear about. If you're someone who loves the forgotten golden eras of motorsport, the unlimited machinery, the wild risk, and the brilliant minds behind some of the fastest cars ever built, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into what makes this story so extraordinary, let me give you a bit of context, because without context, the numbers and achievements don't fully land. American motorsport in the late 1960s and early 1970s was genuinely one of the most exciting eras in racing history. Not just exciting in the way people casually throw that word around, but legitimately, dangerously, almost recklessly exciting. There were no real limits. Engineers could dream up practically anything, bolt it to a chassis, strap an engine into it that had no business being in a racing car, and send it out onto the track to see what happened. Sometimes what happened was a lap record. Sometimes what happened was catastrophic failure. Often it was both, just on different days. And it was into this world that Mark Donohue arrived, not as a daredevil, not as a showman, but as something far more dangerous to the competition. He arrived as an engineer. Mark Donohue was born on March 18, 1937, in Summit, New Jersey. His upbringing was comfortable. His father was a successful attorney, and the family had the kind of financial stability that allowed young Mark to pursue his education properly, without the constant background noise of financial worry that distracts so many talented people. He attended Brown University and studied mechanical engineering. And look, this detail matters more than it might seem at first. Because here is what most people don't realize about Donohue. He was never, at his core, a racing driver. He was an engineer who happened to have an almost supernatural ability to drive racing cars quickly. The distinction sounds small. It is enormous. Most drivers of that era operated on feel. They pushed harder until the car started to become unpredictable, found the limit through instinct, backed off a fraction, and called that good enough. Donohue was fundamentally different in his approach. When a car started sliding under him, he wasn't just processing that information athletically, the way most drivers did. He was running calculations. What forces were creating that behavior? What was happening at the tire contact patch? Was the issue in the suspension geometry, the weight distribution, the tire pressure, the aerodynamic balance? He didn't just want to go faster. He wanted to understand, completely and precisely, why the car was or wasn't going as fast as it theoretically could. That mindset, in an era when racing was more art than science, made him extraordinary. His early career was modest by the standards of what came later. Sports car club events, amateur competitions, the weekend warrior circuit that thousands of enthusiasts participate in without ever making the leap to professional racing. But it was clear to anyone paying attention that Donohue was operating at a different level. His pace was impressive, certainly, but what truly set him apart was the quality of his feedback after each session. He could explain, in precise engineering terms, exactly what the car was doing and exactly what needed to change. That combination, speed plus analytical intelligence, was rare enough to get noticed by people with real resources. One of those people was Roger Penske. Now, to understand the Penske and Donohue partnership, you first need to understand Penske himself. A former driver who had stepped away from racing to focus on business, Penske had built a reputation for an obsession with preparation that genuinely bordered on the clinical. His race shops were famously immaculate. Mechanics wore uniforms that were pressed and clean. Every tool had a designated location, and God help the person who didn't return it there. Winning for Penske was never enough on its own. He wanted to win while being the most organized, the most prepared, the most professional operation in the paddock. When he looked at Mark Donohue, he saw something he recognized. He saw himself, just with extraordinary driving talent attached. In 1966, Penske hired Donohue to drive for his team. It was the beginning of one of the most successful partnerships in the history of motorsport. Their first major campaign was in Trans Am, the SCCA series for sedan racing that had become enormously popular across North America. Penske entered Chevrolet Camaros, and Donohue proceeded to be completely, ruthlessly dominant. He won the Trans Am Championship in 1968 and again in 1969. But here is the thing, and this speaks to exactly who Donohue was as a competitor. He wasn't satisfied with the championships themselves. Between races, between seasons, he was always in the garage, always with engineers, always pushing for the next improvement. He filled notebooks with detailed observations about tire wear at specific corners, brake fade under specific conditions, the effect of small suspension changes on balance through different types of corners. Other drivers thought he was overthinking it. Those drivers finished behind him. By the early 1970s, the partnership had set its sights on bigger horizons. Indianapolis was the most prestigious race in American motorsport, perhaps the most prestigious single race anywhere. In 1972, Penske and Donohue finally conquered it. Donohue drove a McLaren chassis in Penske's signature yellow and blue colors to victory, averaging over 162 miles per hour for 500 miles. It was dominant. It was precise. It was classic Donohue, a performance that looked almost effortless from the outside because so much work had gone into making it look that way. But even Indianapolis, for all its history and prestige, was about to be eclipsed by something wilder, something faster, something almost impossibly powerful. Because next came Can-Am. And Can-Am was where the story gets truly extraordinary. The Canadian-American Challenge Cup, Can-Am for short, was in many respects the most gloriously irresponsible racing series ever sanctioned. The rules, to use the term loosely, were essentially this: build a car, race it. There were no meaningful restrictions on engine displacement, no meaningful restrictions on aerodynamics, no real ceiling on power output or downforce. If you could engineer it, you could race it. And what emerged from that environment was a collection of machines that looked like they had been designed by someone who genuinely did not believe consequences were real. The dominant cars in the early years of Can-Am were running massive American V8 engines, often turbocharged, producing power figures that seemed almost fictional. Teams were fielding cars with over 700, 800, sometimes approaching 1,000 horsepower. These were not particularly light cars. They were not particularly refined cars. They were, in the most literal sense, sledgehammers. And for a while, the biggest sledgehammer usually won. Porsche had watched Can-Am from a distance with the combination of admiration and irritation that tends to motivate German engineering departments. They had dominated sports car racing with the 917, a flat 12 masterpiece that had won Le Mans in 1970 and 1971 and had generally made life miserable for every other manufacturer in endurance racing. But Can-Am was different. The Turbo V8S had a power advantage that Porsche's naturally aspirated flat 12 simply couldn't overcome through refinement alone. So Porsche did what Porsche does. They sat down, looked at the problem from first principles, and engineered a solution that was so effective it didn't just beat the competition. It eliminated them. The answer was the 91710, a turbocharged version of the legendary Flat 12 that arrived in 1972. It was competitive. Donohue won some races. The car showed genuine pace on its better days. But it was still being developed, still finding its limits, and the team that had assembled around it, Penske's operation working with Porsche's engineers and Donohue's analytical mind, was still learning the full potential of turbocharging technology that was genuinely cutting edge at the time. Here's what most people don't realize about turbocharging in 1972. This wasn't a technology that had been refined over decades of motorsport application. The teams using it were writing the rulebook as they went. The boost characteristics, the throttle response, the behavior when you suddenly demanded full power mid-corner, all of it was being discovered through track testing, through failure, through Donohue sitting down after a session and working through exactly what had happened and why. His engineering background wasn't just useful in this environment. It was essential. A driver who operated purely on feel would have struggled to communicate what the car was doing in ways that let the engineers improve it. Donohue could translate the physical sensations of driving a turbocharged racing car into specific, actionable engineering feedback. That feedback made the car better, which made his feedback more refined, which made the car better still. It was a virtuous cycle that culminated in something extraordinary. The Porsche 91730. Let me give you a moment to process those numbers before we talk about the car itself. The turbocharged 5.4-liter flat-12 engine in the 91730 produced somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 horsepower in race trim, depending on the boost setting used. In qualifying trim, with boost turned up to levels that the engine couldn't sustain for a full race without self-destructing, it was reportedly producing closer to 1,500 horsepower. Now look, a modern Formula One car, with its hybrid power unit, advanced materials, and decades of incremental refinement, produces roughly 1,000 horsepower. The 91730 was making 50% more power than that. 50 years ago. With technology that modern engineers would look at and describe as primitive. That is not normal. That is not even close to normal. That is something different entirely. But here is where Donohue's role becomes so important, because raw power on its own is worse than useless. Power you cannot control doesn't make you faster. It makes you a passenger. The history of motorsport is littered with cars that had too much power and not enough of everything else, machines that were theoretically fast on a calculator and practically undrivable on a track. The 91730 required a handling balance, a suspension setup, a tire program, and an aerodynamic configuration that could actually translate all that horsepower into forward motion rather than wheel spin, oversteer, or something more catastrophic. And developing that balance was where Donohue spent months of his life, working with Porsche's engineers, testing endlessly, filling more notebooks, always asking why. The result of all that work was something almost beyond description. In 1973, Mark Donohue and the Penske Porsche 91730 entered the Can-Am season and proceeded to have what remains one of the most dominant championship campaigns in the history of any form of motorsport. He won 6 of the 8 races, not by narrow margins, not in close fights decided in the final lap. He won by the kind of margins that made people question whether there had been some administrative error, whether the timekeepers had made a mistake, whether perhaps the other cars had somehow started late. At Road Atlanta, his qualifying lap was faster than Formula One cars had managed at the same circuit. Think about what that means for a moment. A sports car, running in an American series, was lapping faster than the pinnacle of world motorsport. At Riverside, he won by over a minute. At Laguna Seca, he led every single lap of the race. The competition didn't lose. They were lapped into irrelevance. Now, you might be thinking that this level of dominance sounds exciting, and you'd be right for about 5 minutes. Here is the other thing it did. It killed Can-Am. When a single car is so obviously, so completely superior to everything else in a racing series, the economic logic of competition breaks down. Sponsors pay to be associated with success, or at least with visible competitiveness. When your car is finishing a lap down every race, your sponsor starts asking uncomfortable questions about where their money is actually going. Teams withdrew. Entries dwindled. The series that had once attracted the wildest, most creative machinery in the world became a parade, and nobody pays to watch a parade. By the end of 1973, Can-Am was wounded. It limped through a few more seasons before finally giving up. The 91730 had been so good that it had destroyed the very environment that had made it possible. This is where it gets really interesting, because the story of the 91730 doesn't end with the Can-Am Championship. The car had one more extraordinary chapter to write, and it would be written just days before tragedy struck. But before we get there, let's talk about what Donohue decided to do after that 1973 season, because it tells you everything about who he was as a person. In 1974, Mark Donohue announced his retirement from driving. He was 37 years old. He had won Trans Am championships, the Indianapolis 500, and the most dominant Can-Am season in history. He had driven the most powerful racing car ever built and proven that he could manage it with a level of control that no other driver of the era could match. He was wealthy, respected, and by any reasonable measure had already achieved more in motorsport than most drivers could aspire to in multiple careers. Retirement made complete sense. It was the intelligent decision. It was what anyone looking at the situation from the outside would recommend. It lasted approximately 5 months. The reason it didn't last was Roger Penske, and more specifically, Penske's ambitions in Formula One. The team had made preliminary excursions into Grand Prix racing before, testing the water without fully committing. But now Penske was serious. They were designing and building their own car, the Penske PC1, a full-works effort aimed at competing with the established powers of Formula One. Ferrari, McLaren, Brabham, the teams that had been racing at the highest level for decades with vast resources and institutional knowledge that no newcomer could simply buy overnight. To have any chance of competing with those operations, Penske needed something that money alone couldn't provide. He needed a driver who could develop a new car, who could communicate with engineers about what needed to change and why, who had the mechanical sympathy to keep a still-developing machine in one piece while pushing it hard enough to gather useful data. He needed Mark Donohue. And Donohue, when faced with the offer to compete in Formula One, the one major championship that had eluded him, found that his retirement had a certain flexibility to it that perhaps he hadn't fully appreciated when he announced it. At 38 years old, he came back. And here's the thing about that decision. It wasn't irrational. It wasn't ego without self-awareness. Donohue genuinely believed that the systematic approach he and Penske had applied to Trans Am, to Indianapolis, to Can-Am, could be applied to Formula One as well. The series was different, the circuits were different, the cars were different, but the fundamental challenge was the same. Understand the machine completely, understand what it needs to go faster, and then make those changes with precision and discipline. Why couldn't that work in Formula One? The 1974 season was, by any honest assessment, difficult. The Penske PC1 was a new car from a new team, and new cars from new teams competing against established giants are almost always difficult. Donohue was also learning circuits that the European-based regulars knew intimately, tracks with specific characteristics, specific reference points, specific quirks that take time to fully internalize. He struggled. The results were not what either he or Penske had hoped for. But there were flashes. Moments where the combination of Donohue's talent and the team's meticulous preparation produced something that suggested the potential was there, if they could just keep developing. By the 1975 season, progress was being made. Donohue had switched to a March 751 chassis, while the Penske car continued to be refined, and at the Swedish Grand Prix in June, he finished fifth. A top 5 finish. In Formula One. For a team that was still finding its feet. That was significant. That was the kind of result that tells you something real is being built, that the trajectory is pointed in the right direction. The paddock was starting to take Penske and Donohue seriously as a Formula One operation in a way they hadn't quite before. There was momentum. There was genuine optimism about what the rest of the season might bring. And then came Austria. The Österreichring was one of the fastest, most demanding circuits on the Formula One calendar. Long, sweeping high-speed corners that required a car to be planted and stable at speeds that, by the safety standards of the modern era, are genuinely breathtaking to consider. Beautiful setting, the rolling hills of Styria providing a backdrop that photographers loved and safety officials of today would lose sleep over. The circuit's safety infrastructure, measured against anything we would accept now, was essentially decorative. Armco barriers stood feet from the racing surface. Runoff areas, where they existed at all, were minimal. There was no modern understanding of barrier design, of impact energy absorption, of the physics of protecting a human body inside a crashing racing car. On Saturday, August 16, 1975, during a warm-up session before the Austrian Grand Prix, something failed on Donohue's March 751. The exact cause has been debated, with tire failure being the most widely accepted explanation, though the precise sequence of events was never definitively established. What is certain is that the car left the circuit at very high speed and struck an Armco barrier with devastating force. A trackside marshal was killed instantly. Donohue was extracted from the wreckage alive, but unconscious, with injuries that were immediately understood to be serious. The initial medical assessment was cautious but not catastrophically pessimistic. He had sustained a significant head injury. There were other injuries consistent with a high-speed impact. But he was alive, and in those first hours, the people around him, the team, the medical staff, Roger Penske, held on to the fact that he had survived the impact itself. He seemed to be improving over the following day. There were moments of consciousness, responses that suggested the worst fears might not be realized. The racing world held its breath and hope. On August 19, 1975, 3 days after the crash, Mark Donohue died. A blood clot resulting from the head trauma he had sustained had caused a massive cerebral stroke. He was 40 years old. The exact age at which he had returned to Formula One to chase the one championship that had eluded him was the age at which that chase ended. The news of Donohue's death moved through the motorsport world with the specific weight that comes when someone truly beloved, not just respected but genuinely liked, is suddenly gone. Because here is what separated Donohue from many of his contemporaries in ways that statistics and lap times cannot capture. He was, by every account from everyone who knew him or raced against him, a genuinely good person. In a sport that has historically attracted competitive personalities whose edges are sharp enough to cut, Donohue was something different. His nickname, Captain Nice, was not ironic. It was not a backhanded observation from rivals who meant something else entirely. It was a straightforward description of who he was. He treated mechanics as equals, not as support staff whose job was to serve his ambitions. He congratulated competitors who beat him with a sincerity that made those competitors slightly uncomfortable because they weren't used to it and weren't quite sure what to do with it. He was patient with journalists, generous with his time at autograph sessions, and genuinely interested in the people he met rather than simply performing interest as a public relations exercise. And then there is the book. The Unfair Advantage, published in 1975, is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of motorsport literature. In it, Donohue did something that no serious racing driver had really done before. He shared everything: his testing methodologies, his engineering insights, his systematic approach to developing a racing car, the specific technical details of how he and Penske had achieved the results they achieved. He laid it all out and made it available to anyone who wanted to read it. In a sport where technical advantage is everything, where teams guard their secrets with an intensity that borders on paranoia, this was genuinely extraordinary. It's not normal behavior in racing. It's not normal behavior in most competitive endeavors. It spoke to something fundamental in Donohue's character, a belief that the joy was in the understanding, not just in the winning, and that understanding shared was not advantage lost but knowledge advanced. Roger Penske's grief at Donohue's death was the kind that doesn't fully resolve itself with time, the kind that leaves a permanent mark. Their relationship had been professional in origin but had become something much more than that. They were genuine friends, connected by shared obsessions with excellence, shared standards for preparation, and shared willingness to commit absolutely to whatever they undertook. Penske would go on to build one of the most successful racing operations in the history of the sport. Indianapolis wins in numbers that seem almost absurd. NASCAR dominance. A return to Formula One decades later that produced competitive results. By any metric you choose to apply, Roger Penske is one of the most successful figures motorsport has ever produced. But he never quite found another Mark Donohue. Not because other talented drivers don't exist, they obviously do, but because the specific combination that Donohue represented was genuinely rare. Speed, analytical intelligence, engineering knowledge, the ability to communicate what a car was doing in precise enough terms that engineers could act on it immediately, and the personal qualities that made everyone around him want to work harder on his behalf. You can find some of those qualities in many racing drivers. Finding all of them together in one person is something else. Now, you might be thinking, look, this is sad, but tragedies happen in racing. The sport has always been dangerous. What makes Donohue's story specifically significant beyond the general sadness of any talented person dying too young? And that's a fair question. Here's the answer. It's what his death represented in a broader context, and what it contributed to in terms of how the sport thought about safety in the years that followed. The 1970s were a period of genuine reckoning for Formula One specifically and motorsport generally around the question of whether the danger was inherent and unavoidable or whether it was the result of choices that could be made differently. The safety standards of that era, judged by what we know now about impact physics, about barrier design, about the biomechanics of crashes, were genuinely inadequate. Not inadequate in some theoretical sense. Inadequate in the sense that people were dying at a rate that would be considered completely unacceptable today. Donohue's death, coming as it did to a driver who was at that point very well known, very well liked, and who had come so close to surviving the initial crash, added to the growing pressure that eventually produced meaningful change. The Österreichring was rebuilt. Safety standards across Formula One were progressively improved throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, though the improvement was not linear and more tragedies would occur before the sport truly modernized its approach to safety. The circuit that Donohue crashed on is now a very different place, with the kind of runoff areas, barrier systems, and emergency response infrastructure that might well have meant his survival. There is something particularly difficult about thinking through that counterfactual. He survived the impact itself. His injuries, while serious, were not the kind that in a modern medical context would be considered unsurvivable. The blood clot that killed him formed from trauma that modern helmet technology and modern barrier design might have reduced to a level that didn't produce that outcome. He didn't die because his car was going too fast. He died because of a combination of circumstances: mechanical failure, insufficient safety infrastructure, and the medical limitations of an era when motorsport trauma care was not as advanced as it would become. Let me tell you about those final days in August 1975, because there is one more extraordinary detail that belongs in this story. Just before the Austrian Grand Prix weekend, in the days immediately prior to his death, Donohue had been involved in a record attempt at Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama with the Porsche 91730. The car that had dominated Can-Am 2 years earlier, the most powerful racing machine of its era, was being taken to a banked oval to see exactly how fast it could go in a controlled, closed-course environment. What happened at Talladega in those final August days before the Austrian Grand Prix was one of the most remarkable performance demonstrations in motorsport history. Donohue drove the 9/17:30 around the banked oval at Talladega Superspeedway and recorded a closed-course speed record of 221.160 miles per hour. 221 miles per hour in a car from 1973, on tires that were being stressed to the absolute boundaries of what the rubber compounds of the era were designed to handle. That record would stand for over a decade. Over a decade. Think about what continued to happen in motorsport during those 10-plus years. Think about how many cars were developed, how much technology advanced, how many resources were poured into going faster. And the number that Donohue put on the board in August 1975 still stood. Here's what most people don't realize about that record attempt. It was not simply a matter of pointing the most powerful car ever built at a long straight and pressing the accelerator. At those speeds, the aerodynamics of the 9/17:30 were entering territory that Porsche's engineers had not fully mapped. The downforce characteristics of the car were sensitive to speed in ways that became increasingly significant as you approached 220 miles per hour. The tires were operating at temperatures and loads that exceeded their design parameters. The entire exercise was an act of supreme confidence in both the car and the driver, confidence that Donohue had earned through years of exactly this kind of boundary-pushing work. He ran those laps, recorded that number, and then a few days later drove to Austria for a Formula One warm-up session. The contrast between those two things, the supreme demonstration of his mastery over the most powerful car ever built followed almost immediately by a death in a routine pre-race session, contains something that the human mind struggles to make sense of. You survive the extraordinary moments. You don't survive the ordinary ones. It's the cruelty that racing imposes on any attempt to find narrative logic in what happens on a circuit. Now, I want to talk about something that tends to get lost in discussions of Donohue's career, and that is the specific intellectual contribution he made to how racing cars were developed. Because his legacy isn't just the championships and the records. It's the methodology. It's the approach. And understanding that methodology helps explain why his influence extended so far beyond his own results and his own era. Before Donohue, the relationship between driver and engineer in most racing teams worked roughly like this. The driver drove the car. The driver came back to the pits and said something along the lines of "It feels a bit loose in the rear," or "The front doesn't seem to want to turn in properly." The engineers would make an educated guess about what those descriptions meant in mechanical terms, make some changes, and send the driver out again. It was a process with a lot of noise in it. A lot of the driver's feedback got lost in translation, filtered through imprecise language, and interpreted by engineers who weren't quite sure what the driver was actually experiencing. Donohue changed this. His engineering background meant he could describe what the car was doing in the same technical language that engineers used to talk about what the car was doing. When he said the rear was stepping out under power, he wasn't using the phrase loosely. He could specify at what point in the corner it was happening, at what throttle position, at what steering angle, and what the progression of the behavior felt like through different phases of the corner. That precision of feedback dramatically reduced the noise in the driver-engineer communication loop. Changes could be made more specifically. Results could be evaluated more accurately. The development cycle became faster because the information flowing through it was better. This is the contribution that the unfair advantage documented, and it is the contribution that influenced how teams thought about driver feedback for generations afterward. The best modern drivers, the ones who develop cars most effectively, are the ones who can bridge the gap between physical sensation and technical language in exactly the way Donohue pioneered. He didn't invent the concept of analytical driving, but he demonstrated what was possible when it was taken to its logical conclusion in a way that was impossible to ignore. The Penske operation that emerged from the Donohue years has continued to evolve and dominate. The team has won Indianapolis more times than any other in the race's history. They have been competitive in virtually every major series they have entered. The organizational culture that Penske built, the obsession with preparation, the attention to detail, the belief that races are won in the shop and not just on the track, is a direct legacy of what he and Donohue developed together in those early years of their partnership. Every spotless Penske garage, every precisely arranged tool cabinet, every mechanic in a pressed uniform carries some echo of what those two men built together in the late 1960s. Can-Am as a series is remembered now with a mixture of nostalgia and disbelief. Nostalgia for the creative freedom it represented, the sense that anything was possible if you were smart and brave enough to try it. Disbelief that such a series ever existed at all, that sanctioning bodies ever thought unlimited power and limited safety infrastructure was a workable combination. The cars that raced in Can-Am are museum pieces now, revered by enthusiasts and displayed with the reverence that extraordinary artifacts deserve. The 91730 sits in collections where it is viewed by people who struggle to process the idea that something that looks so purposeful, so brutally functional, was actually driven by human beings at 1,500 horsepower on public road circuits. Let's talk about what Mark Donohue's story means in the larger context of motorsport history, because I think there is a tendency to frame it purely as tragedy, to look at a career cut short and focus on everything that didn't happen. The championships he might have won in Formula One if the Penske operation had continued to develop. The contributions he might have made to engineering and racing car development in the decades that followed. The books he might have written, the drivers he might have mentored, the records that might have been set and then broken and then set again. And those are real losses. They are worth acknowledging. But focusing only on what was lost risks missing the significance of what actually happened, what was actually accomplished in a career that, measured in years of professional racing, was genuinely short. Less than a decade of serious competition. Think about that. Mark Donohue raced professionally at the highest levels for less than 10 years. In that time, he won Trans-Am championships, conquered Indianapolis, dominated Can-Am with a severity that destroyed the series, set a closed-course speed record that lasted over a decade, and helped build a racing organization that continues to win championships today. All of it in under a decade. Most drivers with full careers never come close to that accumulation of achievement. Here's the thing about perfectionism in competitive sport. It is both the quality that drives exceptional achievement and the quality that makes walking away from competition almost psychologically impossible. Donohue's perfectionism was the reason he won so completely. It was also the reason he came back from retirement to chase Formula One. He could not accept that there was a form of racing he hadn't fully engaged with, a challenge he hadn't properly tested himself against. Leaving Formula One unconquered would have felt, to him, like a failure that his actual achievements couldn't compensate for. Not because anyone else would have seen it that way, but because his internal standard was absolute. This is a pattern recognizable in the very greatest competitors across many fields. The inability to leave a challenge unmet is both a gift and a vulnerability. It produces the sustained effort that leads to extraordinary outcomes. It also produces decisions that look, from the outside, like they involve more risk than the person's position strictly requires them to take. Donohue at 38, coming back from retirement to race in Formula One, was making a decision that virtually no disinterested observer would have recommended. He had nothing to prove to anyone. He had everything to lose. And he did it anyway, because walking away from the challenge was genuinely not something he was constitutionally capable of doing. Now, you might be thinking about the question of legacy in more concrete terms. What specifically did Mark Donohue leave behind that continues to shape the sport today? And beyond the organizational culture at Penske, beyond the text of the unfair advantage, beyond the records and the championship results, there is something more fundamental. He demonstrated that the driver-engineer combination, when both qualities are present in the same person or in a truly seamless partnership between two people who each bring one element, can produce results that neither component can achieve independently. The most successful teams in modern motorsport are the ones that have figured out how to create that seamlessness between driving talent and engineering intelligence. The ones where the feedback loop between driver and engineer is tight enough that development moves quickly and in the right directions. The ones where the driver understands what the engineers need from him and the engineers understand what the driver is telling them. That model, that way of thinking about what a racing team needs to be in order to win consistently rather than occasionally, owes a debt to what Donohue and Penske worked out together starting in 1966. There is a memorial at the Österreichring now. The circuit has been rebuilt and renamed, modernized in ways that reflect 50 years of accumulated understanding about what racing circuits need to look like to give drivers a reasonable chance of surviving the inevitable moments when things go wrong. Formula One returned to it and continues to race there, and the crashes that occur are survivable in ways that the crash that killed Donohue was not. The sport has genuinely learned from the tragedies of his era, improved itself in ways that are measurable in the survival statistics of subsequent decades. The safety revolution in Formula One specifically, which accelerated dramatically through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, drew on a body of painful experience that included moments like Donohue's death. The people who pushed for better barriers, better runoff areas, better helmet technology, better car construction standards, they were motivated by specific memories of specific drivers who didn't survive crashes that, with better infrastructure, they might have walked away from. Donohue is part of that motivation. His death contributed to a conversation that eventually produced real change. Let me bring this back to the 9/17/30 one more time, because the car deserves a final moment of attention before we close. In the 50 years since it raced competitively, the Porsche 9/17/30 has not been surpassed as a symbol of what happens when you remove all practical limits from racing car engineering and let genuinely brilliant people build whatever they can conceive. The car was obscene in the best possible way. It was excessive by any reasonable standard. It produced power figures that were not supposed to be achievable with the technology of the early 1970s. It handled those power figures because one of the most analytically gifted racing drivers who ever lived spent months figuring out exactly how to make it do so. When you look at photographs of the 9/17/30 and Donohue together, there is something almost perfectly matched about them. The car looks like it was designed specifically for a driver who was also an engineer. Complex, technical, demanding absolute precision from whoever sat inside it, but capable of astonishing things in the hands of someone who took the time to truly understand it. Donohue was exactly that person. The combination of his talent and that car produced something that the sport had never quite seen before and has never quite seen again. Mark Donohue was 40 years old when he died. He had been racing professionally for less than a decade. He had won championships across multiple series, dominated with a car that was historically powerful, set records that endured for years, and helped build an organization that continues to win today. He was a genuinely kind person in a hard sport, a generous competitor in an environment where generosity is often treated as weakness, and an engineer who happened to be one of the fastest racing drivers in the world during his era. The Unfair Advantage, his book, his real legacy, remains in print. It remains read. Drivers and engineers who weren't born when Donohue died read it now and find in it a clarity of thinking about how to make a racing car faster that feels as relevant today as it did when he wrote it. The warm-up session in Austria should have been unremarkable. A routine morning of track time before a Grand Prix, the kind of session that happens dozens of times in a racing season without incident. That it wasn't, that it became the last thing Mark Donohue ever did in a racing car, is the specific cruelty of the sport. You can survive the record attempts at Talladega, the 1,500 horsepower Can-Am monsters, the endless development testing at the limits of what a car can do. And then a Saturday morning in Austria becomes the thing that ends it. Racing doesn't reward history or reputation or accumulated skill when something goes wrong. It is entirely indifferent to all of that. What we are left with is a story that contains everything: extraordinary achievement and sudden loss. A partnership that produced results neither man could have achieved alone. A car so powerful it killed the series it competed in. A driver so good he came back from retirement to chase the one challenge left, and a legacy that continues to shape how the sport thinks about what a racing driver can and should be. That is Mark Donohue. That is the engineer who became a driver, the perfectionist who helped change motorsport forever, and the man they called Captain Nice. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and let me know in the comments whether you had heard of Mark Donohue before today, because if you hadn't, I genuinely hope this changed that. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.